I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my friend. I'm happy to be able to say that, my friend Catalina Martinez as our keynote speaker for this afternoon. She's the current regional program manager for NOAA's ocean exploration with the office of, within an office in the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. She's a certified diversity professional with 3 graduate degrees from University of Rhode Island. And she began her ocean science career as a 2002 John A. Knauss Marine Policy Fellow. So she's worked with NOAA ocean exploration ever since. Some other highlights, she works at the local, regional, and national levels to mitigate the barriers to entry, persistence, and success for underrepresented scholars into STEM fields. She's received numerous awards over the years, and most recently in 2019, she was awarded the Women of Color in STEM Diversity Leadership in Government Award for demonstrating sustained leadership in creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive federal workforce. She most recently completed a 12-month assignment with NOAA's Office of Inclusion and Civil Rights, working on a variety of efforts to help expand their diversity, equity, and inclusion portfolio. So I met Catalina in a mentoring space, and over the years, we've become colleagues and friends. And so it is my distinct pleasure to turn it over to her. We're about to receive some great treats, but she exemplifies and acts on what she's speaking on. She is doing the hard work. She really is. So I hope we all learn from her. Catalina?
As are you, Trita. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I feel so fortunate to call you a friend as well. Thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
So hi, everyone. I am going to try and share my screen without losing you. I'm on an ancient computer that I am determined to use, so bear with me. And excuse me, and let me go into presentation mode, and then you'll have to tell me what you see. You see just my slide?
Yes.
Whoop, whoop. Great. So I love seeing all the acknowledgements and honorings coming in through the chat. It's a beautiful thing. And I'm so honored to be here speaking with you all today as part of this really important program we have a powerful lineup of panelists coming in a bit, and incredible organizers and coordinators and facilitators. So thank you for allowing me to be here today with you all. So I'd like to acknowledge that I live on the traditional land of the Narragansett Nation in Rhode Island, and the Narragansett people continue to thrive and prosper in this region of the country, despite widespread historic territorial appropriation and genocide. I am so thankful for their presence. I'd also like to acknowledge that Southern Rhode Island, where I live, was the site of the largest African slave holdings in New England, and it's not possible to decouple the two, as records indicate African and Indigenous captives in this region on appropriated land. So I acknowledge all of this as we enter our experience together today. And again, I'm really honored to be part of this important common team to unpack challenging topics while trying to identify effective practices as we all continue to grapple with the continued homogeneity of our STEM spaces and places. And I chose this title, Equity Through Access, Mitigating Barriers to STEM for Marginalized and Minoritized Scholars, with intention, as we heard about on day 1 of the Charrette from Dr. Brandon Jones. And our understanding and reckoning in this DEIAJ realm continues to evolve, as does the language and our collective understanding of the impact of our words. So I'll specifically be talking about the challenges and barriers faced by those individuals and groups who are not part of the dominant culture in STEM. Dominant culture classified as white, non-Hispanic, Latino, and still predominantly male. So I'm specifically speaking about the barriers to entry for those of us who have been historically, consistently, and contemporarily excluded and minoritized, and also those not from privileged backgrounds, as access to certain resources and networks can help mitigate some, but certainly not all barriers. So I share this important quote taken from Dr. Vernon Morris's excellent and important article from March of this year. We must remove the onus from those individuals for whom damage is being done and work hard not to use deficit language as it problematizes the victim. And I'm going to begin with a very brief introduction of who I am and how I got to be talking with you all today. And in short, it was a long, windy road that I'll condense into a few slides. But first, it's often said that who your parents are has as much or more to do with where you will end up in life than any other single factor. And I really believe that. In large part, the social and economic structure a child is born into dictates access to opportunities and resources on all levels, including quality of our education, right? And thus our future prospects. It carves out our identity and it determines our access as well as our chances for success in large part. And as we're well aware, life circumstances are inherently unequal. But where you begin your life doesn't necessarily have to determine where you end up. And as we all know too well, though, the opportunity gaps and systemic inequities and injustices in this country continue to grow, making it harder and harder to alter the trajectory that's inextricably linked to our chance of birth. And many of you may relate to the fact that I didn't have a direct path to ocean science, and I faced some challenges that might be familiar to some of you. I grew up in a hardworking Cuban immigrant family of little means, mostly living with my grandparents, so I'm first gen in a multitude of ways. We were rather nomadic for some time because my family was in the horse racing business, so we moved around a lot based on where racetracks were open and closed seasonally. At some point, we settled in Providence, Rhode Island, because there were 2 racetracks here, and it was a center of the New England racing circuit at that time. I was pulled out of school often as a child to help care for my sick grandmother and to work to help the family in many other ways. My grandparents believed that girls didn't need an education and that only boys should go to school. Thankfully, we lived in a very diverse community, so I saw there was more out there in the world for me and for girls in general than what I could see within the very limited perspectives and beliefs of my own family. I'll let you all guess which one is me in that fabulous photo. Not surprisingly, I dropped out of high school at the age of 16 and was completely self-supporting and living on my own from that point on, although I continued to help to care for my family. Somehow I always knew I needed an education to increase my earning potential and improve my circumstances, although I didn't have the language for it at the time. So very early on, I started the long road to obtain the education of my choosing. And there were a lot of obstacles I had to overcome, and I had to work really hard, several jobs at a time, while I chipped away at my education. I spent many years working in direct human service related jobs. I worked with homeless populations and women and children who were victims of abuse for a long time. And I even helped start a school for potential dropouts called UCAP, or the Urban Collaborative Accelerated Program that you see here in Providence. The school is amazing and it's still going strong. I also became a people collector, and those of you who are in my collection know that I am definitely a people collector, and I learned to build family out of community wherever I went, and that has remained important throughout my personal and professional life. So it took many years, but eventually I found my way to the University of Rhode Island. I didn't obtain an undergraduate degree until I was ancient, until I was 30 years old, and I continued my education until I was satisfied. I now have 4 degrees from URI. It might be a record. I'm not sure, but I have a BS in zoology, a master's in oceanography, another master's in marine policy or marine affairs, and an MBA. All of my degrees are from URI because I was fortunate enough to work my way up to get there. And I love URI, I really do, but mainly because I couldn't move out of Rhode Island due to my life circumstances and my family obligations. Through hard work, determination, and definitely a bit of luck, I was able to alter the trajectory of my life and not allow the circumstances of my birth, the oppressive gendered beliefs of my family, or the perceptions of others dictate that for me. But I'm the exception and not the rule, and that's not okay. We know that our ocean science spaces and places do not reflect the gorgeous diversity of this country, and that after decades of failed programs and efforts to change this, we've barely made any progress at all. And as you heard in my intro, I'm certain that the only reason I'm sitting before you today with a nearly 20-year career with NOAA is, again, I had some luck, and I was selected back in 2002 as a John Knaus Marine Policy Fellow while completing graduate school at URI, one of my degrees anyway. And the only reason I was selected was because I had a powerful champion at that time who helped propel me forward. Now, although my path to ocean sciences was not direct, and it took me a really long time, my path into NOAA was very direct for this reason, right? Knaus is a bridge to a career and professional network like no other, as are all high-value elite fellowships of this type. We are very well aware of that, right? And students selected into these programs have their lives altered in significant ways. These opportunities are not only often a financial windfall for students, but they're iterative gateways to important academic and professional opportunities, networks, and careers. They're gateways to life-changing opportunities that are nearly inaccessible to people like me. People who come from challenging circumstances, who aren't born into the cultural or political capital to build the skills or to be coached on how to be competitive in these spaces. People who are not part of the dominant culture, right? Learning to overcome significant adversity to find success left me with particular challenges and gaps, certainly. But it also provided me with a very special perspective that allows me and people like me to identify some of the barriers, not only into entry into these programs, but also those inherent in the culture, behaviors, the practices that can create environments that are not conducive to our success. I've never run a program myself, but it's through my lived experiences, my professional opportunities, and work that I've been doing for many years with a variety of groups and programs seeking to diversify that I speak from today. Thankfully, there are many groups out there doing this work now, and many of you are here today, but barriers to entry into your programs and many others remain significant and pervasive. And as we know, they can exist at every stage in the process for some. Unfortunately, this is as evident today as it's always been, which is why we continue to come together like this and have these conversations, right? So we know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that through significant demographic shifts, diversity is undoubtedly increasing in this country. It's also essential for good science, but it remains only through deliberate thought and actions that this can occur in STEM, because we know our STEM spaces and places remain relatively homogeneous. At this point, diversity is quite simply a choice or a series of choices to do things very differently if we really want to reach and serve groups we know we're not currently reaching and serving. So what can we do to bridge these enormous, historic, persistent gaps? That's why we're here today. So let's talk a bit about some of the more common barriers and challenges, and maybe some of those that we may not think about too much, as well as some of the effective practices that help catalyze our thoughts for the breakout groups later. So in terms of working to diversify our experiential opportunities, those internships, fellowships, scholarships, it goes without saying, that recruitment is critical to diversify the applicant pool, and engagement and recruitment was the highest percentage from our poll just a few minutes ago. So I'm not going to spend time here. I'll just say that all too often, recruitment practices remain passive and therefore ineffective. I'll just stress that, as we heard on day one, your process has to be intentional and relational, right? You have to really meet people where they are, develop relationships in spaces and maybe with people you haven't considered at this point. Keeping in mind that those of us who help recruit from our precious networks of diverse scholars, we have to first believe that your program or opportunity is a safe space where they're going to be cared for and truly valued and supported properly. It'll take more effort and resources to reach groups you're not reaching, so this has to be accounted for up front. And more than anything, diversity efforts cannot begin and end with recruitment. There is much more work to do. Proper guidance on application requirements and how to develop a competitive application are critical. Equity simply doesn't exist on college campuses in terms of grooming, information sharing, and guidance. We know that many more students start but don't complete applications, and that this lack of guidance, mentoring, encouragement, and general assistance are pervasive factors that are somewhat tangible barriers that can be mitigated through thoughtful intervention. And I urge you all to go back to your respective programs and take a look at your applicant flow data if you have that capability. Look at who is starting but not completing your applications and where they fall out in the process. Hopefully you're collecting demographic data by now. This should provide some insight. If you're not yet collecting demographic data, you really have to start there. These data sets are problematic. We know that in the way they group us. And they're always voluntary, so they're incomplete, but they're all we've got. And I'd like to just take a minute to give a shout out to the Ocean Discovery Institute and to Aradhana Tripathi, who will be on our panel in a bit, from UCLA's Center for Diverse Leadership in Science. They gave me the opportunity to work with their incredible students and staff on an informal barriers study back in 2019, pre-COVID. I so miss those days when we could gather. So there are many challenges with the standard requirements for submissions and in the rubrics used, rubrics that are really typical to measure the applicants, and we don't really have time for an in-depth discussion. But in general, there's a lot of bias and expectation of privilege built into the general application requirements. Some are more obvious and insurmountable for many, like a minimum GPA. But then there are steep expectations, such as students having participated in relevant out-of-classroom experiences by the time they're sophomores, for example, or having built relationships with faculty substantial enough to ask for letters of recommendation within the first few years as an undergrad. A lot of that comes down to learning those unwritten rules, right? Early grooming, having cultural, economic, and political capital. This brings us back to the chance of birth. And research demonstrates that letters of recommendation can introduce bias, and some groups are dropping them altogether. Instead, they're asking for references and sending out tactical questions to obtain pertinent information needed to make a comprehensive review. This standardizes the process to some degree in an attempt to level the playing field, and it has shown some success at mitigating bias. There's also the burden to the few faculty and/or other professionals from diverse backgrounds like myself who are tapped into for these letters repeatedly. It becomes a part-time job during certain times of the year, I can tell you that. And without clear guidance, personal essays become very long and with no direction. And so they're impossible to review equitably. Some groups are beginning to use carefully crafted essay prompts instead of open-ended essays, and providing clear guidance on essay length, keeping them to a reasonable length for the benefit of both the applicants and the reviewers. This provides opportunity to obtain concise, informative answers in a more equitable manner, and that can aid in your review and selection process as well. And clearly, non-native English speakers are at an obvious disadvantage. And as a reviewer of too many programs myself, I can tell you that traditional rubrics absolutely perpetuate advantages of those already advantaged. And so the notion of transitioning to a more holistic method is important to consider. And that means assessing all of the data and information about an applicant to really consider their potential rather than determining whether or not they fit into a mold crafted by dominant culture, values, and norms. And this could be an all-day conversation around that, so I'll just leave it there. And we know that the homogeneity of our reviewer pools is problematic, and the lack of training and guidance for reviewers, so bias and defaulting to what and who they know can and often does prevail at this stage. Final selections are as much an art form as anything else, and I learned this from so many programs that I've worked with. There's plenty of opportunity for creativity there, but you have to consider all the barriers and pitfalls that occur prior to that final cohort to select from. How did you get there? And then if you're fortunate enough to end up with a diverse cohort, there are additional crucial considerations, right? Of the fortunate few who are selected, do they have a sense that they truly belong? And is that based on internal factors or the environment or both? We have to get away from the term imposter syndrome and really start putting the onus off the individual. We all know that when we feel we don't belong, it's typically because the environment, the culture doesn't embrace us. I'd love to see us shift our mindsets and begin calling it what it is, imposter environment, right? And from the words of my great friend who spoke with us on day one, who I stole this slide from, the fish might be sick, but it's because your water's nasty. Thank you, Brandon Jones. And Rainey and colleagues published a great article a few years ago, ground truthing what we knew to be true about how belonging relates to persistence of students, and specifically women and students of color in STEM academic programs. So there's no surprises here, right? That sense of belonging significantly impacts our persistence and success, particularly for students of color and women. Women experience a lower sense of belonging in comparison to men. And we know that intersectionality matters, right? So when race and gender intersected, both men and women of color reported a lower sense of belonging. And while white men were most likely to report a sense of belonging, women of color were least likely. Again, no surprises there, but it's nice to have the article to cite. So we need to be intentional and consider cohort models, right? Where you ensure critical mass instead of creating that lonely only. And that's as true for your faculty and staff as it is for your students. I see this on campuses all the time. Keep in mind that the other side of othering is belonging. And we all have to do our own internal individual work and begin to center humanity in all that we do and in the experiences we craft for our students. Recognize your own privilege and gain insight into how intersectional identities work together to either offer particular benefits and advantages or limit access and compound those impacts of oppression and exclusion. And we really have to educate ourselves on the generational impacts of systemic racism and how it continues to play out in STEM. There are many programs out there. Thankfully, in the past couple of years, the resources have really been amplified. And consider the foundations and frameworks from which we all operate and are trained by in our powerful academic and government institutions, and how they were crafted by the dominant culture they are operating as intended. And taking the conversation a step further, because that's who I am, and because I continue to have far too many conversations about this subject with regard to all manner of our STEM spaces and places, there remain significant, pervasive issues and challenges that we have to at least be aware of in the assault and harassment arenas to truly create environments that are safe and conducive to the success of all. And for those who haven't seen this BuzzFeed article, Welcome to the Jungle, it just came out on December 9th, and I encourage you to look it up and give it a read. I'm thankful that in the past couple of years, the conversations around all of these very difficult issues have been amplified, and resources are certainly out there. But the fact that we continue to rely on bystander intervention training and emergency response protocols, we really have to push forward in new ways to truly dismantle deeply ingrained toxic environments and behaviors that have been normalized for far too long. I'm sure there are many excellent resources out there that folks in the audience can share links to in the chat. In terms of the specifics associated with barriers and programmatic components, I always share the GeoRU handbook, as it's a great one-stop shop for a variety of topics and effective practices that we've been discussing for the past couple of days, or the workshop itself. And Valerie Sloan is going to begin working with authors to update this version of the handbook because it's considered evergreen, which is really important. And I'm honored to be working with her in coming months on that. So with all that said, let's be intentional about the experiences our students and other young professionals are having so that everyone can have this opportunity, right? It's what we're selling, instead of this, which is the reality for some of us, right? And ask yourself, are the environments, the culture, the mentors I'm pairing our students with, and the surrounding community where they're going to live and operate in, are they safe spaces for these precious students from diverse backgrounds? What are we doing to pave the way properly and to develop proper support structures for the duration of their experiences? Let's also center humanity to be more relational rather than transactional in how we approach all that we do, and continue to educate ourselves about how best to do this work. And I'll leave you with just a few thoughts. What are you prepared to adjust, to do differently, to potentially dismantle in order to change your outcome? How will you use your positionality and your spheres of influence and power to reimagine your processes, your procedures, and more importantly, to shift mindsets and tactically disrupt to affect change? Let's be deliberate in our efforts to mitigate barriers and amplify the voices of the marginalized, and champion students and scholars from groups who remain so sorely underrepresented, because they are going to lead us on a new journey, and they're going to be the wave of change we need. And for those who, like me, may not have started out with the best circumstances. Never limit your vision of who you can become or where you belong based on what you see around you today. Remember that where you begin your life doesn't necessarily have to determine where you end up. A wise young woman I met a few years ago who'd been homeless for some time said to me, Catalina, it's not what's on you, it's what's in you. And I live by this mantra every day. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Catalina. That was amazing. Gave us all some points to think about. At this time, we're going to open the floor up for a few questions, and we've gotten a few. The first of which, and some folks in the chat have started responding to this, but asking you directly. Can you provide some examples of one of those holistic review processes that you mentioned, like the holistic review process, and give an example of how that kind of worked or how that looked?
Yeah, I hear from a lot of different groups. Even this morning, we had a barrier session during AGU, and we had one of our speakers talked about how they've created a more holistic way of assessing their applicants rather than just those standard rubrics. It really is a process, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to chip away at it. If you're just going to use traditional rubrics and those value systems, you're not really assessing the potential of the individual. You're really, measuring them against rubrics that are unjust and inequitable, right? So one of the best programs that I know of that I always point to, and I can't see the attendees list right now, so we may have someone on from the Woods Hole Partnership Education Program, Woods Hole PEP. They are one of the best out there in terms of how to create a holistic way of assessing their applicants. It takes more effort and resources, right? They're able to talk to each one of their applicants. So say your applicant, has less than a 3.0, you can call them up and talk to them about what their journey has been like. If you have an applicant who has had to, work while they're in school full time, take care of family members, have a long commute because they have to live at home because they can't afford to be on campus. And it takes them a lot longer than 4 years to get an undergraduate degree. Their GPA suffers, right? So if they're the ones applying to your program, as far as I'm concerned, those are superpowers. Learning how to overcome significant adversity and still find any level of success, they're having to innovate in spaces that you probably haven't even had to think about. So those are superpowers as far as I'm concerned. And so you need to learn more about their journey rather than just those rubrics that you ask them for. And some of those ideas that I posed are in that GORU handbook. They go into a little more depth about different components of those rubrics and those requirements that you can potentially dismantle to make the process more just and equitable. So is someone here from Woods Hole PEP that wants to talk a bit about their holistic program? Their holistic process?
I don't know if we have anyone today.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Thank you. The next question. The commenter said, I'm interested in understanding more about potential damage or harm stemming from required trainings, which may solidify bias. What are some potential or best alternatives?
Required training in reference to what point? I'm sorry.
Like, everyone has to do diversity training. Let's do implicit bias training, as an organization. But what about the potential damage or harm that can be caused by that, and some alternatives?
I am not an expert in that kind of training. I'm not sure what harm they're speaking of, but certainly I've participated and hosted workshops myself where, you have no control over what people are going to say or write into the chat. And so trauma can happen, harm can happen. I'm not exactly sure which kind of harm they're speaking of. But when you're trying to build equity in the mindsets of your deciders, your gatekeepers, having training or at least some kind of conversation around affinity bias, defaulting to what those different kinds of biases that are built in and deeply ingrained, that has shown to benefit the outcome in a more equitable manner if you do it very close to your review panels, not, a great distance apart. But it gives people the mindset to think about the fact that they're defaulting to, say, schools or backgrounds that are more familiar to them. So some of those things can be helpful. And certainly who your trainer is matters too, right? They can cause harm.
Yeah. And maybe a bit of a follow-up to that point on the training aspect. So yes, many organizations and institutions do offer implicit bias training or bystander training and so on and so forth. But they don't always reach the people who need to be there. And do you have any suggestions for people?
Let's face it, especially
Yeah,
on academic campuses. I mean, I see it here at URI where I spend a great deal of time. You have a lot of different types of employment, right? Some people are in unions, some people are not. You have interns, fellows, students, faculty, staff. So you can't force people to take this kind of training. And if you force it, it's typically not going to be effective anyway if they're forced to be there, right? So honestly, we preach to the choir. That's what we do, because those who show up, they tend to want to know better, do better, and be better. Those who don't show up are often, the individuals who may be, problematic. But when you're looking at trying to shift culture, you have to tackle not only the individual bad actors, right, in some way, but you really have to shift the processes, the procedures, the frameworks, the systems, the structures that are foundational, right? As I mentioned, we know that these deeply ingrained, white male majority cultures and histories of academia and the federal government and state governments, they were created by and for a dominant group. So in order for us to expect anything to be different, we have to reimagine it. And that may mean dismantling.
Got it. Absolutely. A question, and actually Vernon brought this up. He's like, what about measuring, in the review panels in the terms of review panel process? What about measuring potential applicants against the resources that are available to them, that they've had available to them?
I'd love to hear more about that, Vernon. What I've seen it done in an inartful way, I'll say, insensitive way, many times, where they'll ask a question as part of the personal essays that can traumatize people, right? Because it's as though you're measuring people against their poverty, their hardships, and that is clearly inartful and insensitive, right? So I'm sure there are better ways to do that. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear more from Vernon about what his thoughts are in order to, give opportunity where it might not exist otherwise. One of the things I see all too often is that they look in these personal essays for these students to have had high-level experiences previously. And if you're looking to do that, then obviously you're selecting people who already have had some kind of an advantage. So maybe you can look for students who aren't speaking of particular experiences that they've already had. But I'd love to hear from Vernon.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
All right.
I can't see you. Oh, there we go. There you are.
I'm here trying to eat like Lisa, so apologies. I think you've kind of touched on some of the aspects of it. I agree with you. It can be done in a really awkward and offensive way, if not only inartful. But one of the things that we did in the NOAA Cooperative Science Center that I think you're aware of is that we redesigned the program. So we designed a program that was specific to emerging scholars who did not have any research experience. Take those resources off the table, right? And you can begin to level the playing field. Sometimes a level playing field still advantages certain individuals, but to use that wording, you can try to design the program so that you take out or privileges that people have. I think it's certain academic institutions have offices that generate recommendation letters. So I think it's an excellent idea. Take out the reference letters, use references. Who can give you references, right? That's a privilege. How many people can give you a reference at a certain point? And so it's not so much probing the individual applicant to determine what their resources are so that you can then make a decision. It's actually putting in some of the work to redesign your programs that you can reach the audiences and folks that you want to be more inclusive to. So it's really in the redesign of inclusive research opportunities.
I love that, Vernon. Thank you so much. And absolutely, I can't tell you how many programs I'm a reviewer for where I've come to the point where I just can't do it anymore. Because if I use their guidance and their rubrics, I'm just selecting extremely advantaged students. I won't do it. I won't do it anymore. So, you know, I really wish that there would be more dismantling going on and reimagining that way.
Great, thank you. We were going to do one more question, and Beth in the chat kind of answered it, but I'm still going to ask you anyway. You know, to tell us a bit more about the programs that are dropping reference letters. And in the chat, Beth mentions for their scholarship applications, they've incorporated peer reference letters rather than reference, you know, like a mentor-mentee type of reference letter. And they found them to be very informative and helpful. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'd love to take a look at something like that. You know, but again, these reference letters are so problematic. I've started, when I do reviews now, I take them and I highlight all the gendered or racialized language. I'm just over it. You know, I won't use them to evaluate people anymore. I just won't. And I just hope that, you know, a wave of change happens and we start really reimagining how to assess the potential of individuals beyond these very, you know, privileged rubrics.
Right. I agree. I think about that. I just did a review a few months ago, and I found the review letters a bit problematic, but yeah, it was hard.
And the personal statements, my goodness, if you're not giving them good guidance, they can be a book and they're off on tangent. Yeah, I can't review that, you know. You really need to start asking really targeted questions. And I don't know if we have Khadija here with us. Is she in the room there with you, Vernon? Because, you know, with her SOARS program in Boulder, they are using some of these really effective practices in their processes. They've switched over to really targeted questions for their students and instead of those long form essays and things like that. And that GeoRU handbook gives you a lot of guidance like this. These are not things that I'm making up. They come directly from programs that are out there doing this work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Catalina, with that, we're going to give you a break for a moment. I'm going to hand it back over to Sam, but thank you so much for those words and being very blunt and honest. I think you've set the tone for our discussions today, and I hope that people have been taking notes so that when we go into our breakout groups and our focus group, we can really have some meaningful conversations with intent. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you all today.